Regulated.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
This podcast focuses on regulatory and corporate developments in highly regulated spaces. I'm Christian Bax, and I used to regulate medical marijuana.
I'm Tony Glover, and I used to regulate alcoholic beverages, casino gaming, and tobacco. Now together, we're regulated.
All right, welcome back to another week of the Regulated Pod. Pat Oglesby is with us today. Pat is a North Carolina lawyer and the founder of the Center for New Revenue, a tax policy nonprofit. He has served as chief tax counsel for the U.S. Senate Finance Committee and as co-chair of the Regulatory and Tax Structure Working Group of Gavin Newsom's Blue Ribbon Commission on Marijuana Legalization. He's here today mostly because he's one of my favorite follows on Twitter. He has a very unique perspective, I think, as far as my follows on the taxation and some of the macro policy for how cannabis should be regulated. And his focus is on tax policy. And I promise you, you should totally check out the Center for New Revenue and Pat's Twitter feed, because it's not dry. Taxing, I'm sure you would agree with me, Pat. Tax can be very interesting and sometimes kind of humorous to follow.
That's right. Yeah, too humorous sometimes.
So I went back and I read a lot of your blog, and I saw that your first post was way back in February of 2010. And so I was kind of hoping that you could walk us through what the genesis for the Center for New Revenue and kind of how you got into thinking about cannabis.
Great. Yeah. Well, I was a tax bureaucrat working for Congress, writing tax laws. And I did that for 8 years. And it's a specialty like any other. And writing tax laws, figuring out how to prevent people from beating the system and seeing where the loopholes are. I did that for 8 years, and then I retired from that, moved to North Carolina and did other things, kept my law license. And then in 2009, I think it was, I heard Obama say, yes, we can, and kind of figured what needs doing in this country that where I might bring something. And it was clear to me that cannabis prohibition was not going to stand the test of time, that it was going to erode, and that part of what replaced prohibition was going to be a government revenue source, that the politics demanded that there was going to be a tax or state stores or some way that it wasn't going to go to the tomato model, the total free market that a lot of people insist on even today. And that's a philosophical approach, but they don't have the votes for it. So that I think of taxation as it's possible to think of it as the handmaiden of legalization. That taxation is necessary to having a legalized commercial market. So I figured let's see what needs to be done. And I started reading and writing, and nobody else was interested in it at the time from the tax policy standpoint. Tax policy is a tiny little field. There are lots of tax lawyers and accountants, but tax policy is more what should the law be rather than what is the law and what should clients do about it. And I had that background.
And I love the theme. So when I read your writing, a lot of the themes seem to be centered around the concept of simplicity versus fairness. Yeah, and one of your early blogs that I read, I think was from August of 2010, so way back, was it talked about the example of bagels, right? And how you had these three classes of bagels. You had sliced bagels, unsliced bagels, and the bagels with cream cheese. And the inherent ridiculousness that a bagel that's sliced is charged at a 9% tax rate, while a bagel that's you just buy at the store is not taxed. And that the solution is not to just charge 4.5% for a sliced bagel and split the baby in half. The solution is to actually treat a sliced bagel like a real bagel, as common sense and fairness would dictate. But fairness and simplicity are sometimes enemies of each other, right? So they don't go hand in hand. And so what I've been interested is, because when you write about fairness, though, there's also this public health piece, right? So there's these externalities that come into play. So it's not really as simple as business or consumer versus the government. There's also children. There's people who are very, very heavy users who sometimes can't control their use. And then you have these huge multinational now corporations that have entered into the cannabis space.
The hardest one to me is the medical issue, that a lot of the states want to give a tax break to medical cannabis, medical marijuana. Figuring out who gets that it's really a different question from the when medical only is legal and recreational is not. The downside of saying somebody is a medical patient when they aren't, somebody gets away with using gets to pretend to be a patient. But if you're going to have a tax and you have some kind of tax break for medical people, how do you figure out who that is? Who's really sick? And the doctors, I think California shows that relying on the doctors doesn't work, or it didn't work there. That's a question that is just incapable of analysis. Nobody can ever to go and identify people one by one. I mean, it's very hard, and to try to prevent people from posing as patients and buying cheaper and reselling or maintaining the tax system. And that's just not fairness. Is medical patients shouldn't pay tax. Simplicity is not everybody pays the same. That's a classic dilemma.
And it's interesting because when you watch this develop over the last decade, that tax piece is a really important piece once a state legalizes adult use as to what the ultimate fate of the medical program is, right? So if you're like Colorado and you maintain a lot of the tax breaks that you had for medical patients, the medical program, at least even it plateaus and maybe slowly declines. Whereas if you have in Washington, where there's really not a whole lot of benefit to being a medical patient, the program kind of withers on the vine and essentially dies out while the recreational program eats its lunch.
Right, exactly. So that's the choice. But it's just an impossible dilemma between simplicity and fairness.
I wanted to kind of shift into 280E. And the origin of 280E is back in the early 80s. Bob Dole, Senate Finance Committee, created this structure where you basically, it's people who produce illegal drugs, federally prohibited substances, are very limited on what they can deduct. But one of the things I kind of wanted to start the conversation with was a case you wrote about, which was Edmondson versus Commissioner, which I think is absolutely fascinating because it's a guy who was a drug dealer who challenged his ability to deduct his operating expenses, and he won. So can you just kind of walk us through what the fact pattern was for that case? Because I think it's amazing.
Yeah, the guy was selling, I can't remember what illegal drug. It wasn't marijuana.
It was everything.
Yeah,
it was like coke.
everything.
It was marijuana.
Yeah.
It was Percocets. It was everything.
And he said, "Well, I drove my truck, and I should get to deduct the mileage, just like anybody who's delivering pizza gets to deduct the mileage when they drive their truck to deliver stuff, that kind of thing." And the tax court said, "Yeah, that's right. That illegal activity is taxable just like everything else."
And that was crazy. So the guy he doesn't keep books, but he claims $105,000 in income, and he's got amphetamine tablets, he's got marijuana, bricks of marijuana, he's got coke, and he has 23,000 miles he's trying to expense, and he's got a trip to San Diego where of course he's also expensing his dinner and his entertainment, a scale to weigh his drugs, and he all of those are business expenses.
Right.
So that to me, I'm not a tax policy expert, but I think a lot of people who are discovering this topic for the first time, and let's just go ahead and cut out the legalized marijuana movement of the last 2 decades, right? Let's go back to the 80s with the fact that the IRS is so powerful that people are still paying taxes to them, and in doing so, basically admitting that they're conducting an illegal activity.
Right. Yeah, that's how Al Capone went to jail, for tax evasion, rather than the many crimes he committed.
What is the scale of that? I'm sorry if this is a stupid question, but is it common for people who are engaged in illegal activity to file income taxes and seek those type of deductions?
A good question, and a lot of times they will. I really don't know. I mean, this is way underground when they do, and all that's confidential. The IRS can't disclose anything, as we're seeing with Trump when they have Trump's tax returns, and there's been no leak in any way from the IRS. So there's a lot of stuff we just don't know.
So walk us through. You have the situation where it's established in law at this point that people who are selling drugs can expense their operating expenses, right? And so then you have Bob Dole and the Senate Finance Committee now have their say. So kind of walk through what happens at that point.
Well, this was 1982, and I just actually, by happenstance, joined the staff of the Joint Tax Committee. I was working on other stuff, and this came in. It was the Reagan was in. It was the war on drugs, and this case came to the attention of it. It turned out to be Bill Armstrong, who was senator from Colorado then, of arch conservative, who brought it to Dole's attention. Bob Dole, who was chairman, and he said, we want to do something about the war on drugs. We're the tax writing committee. Let's go after these drug dealers and overturn this tax court case that says they can deduct their expenses. Now, they can still deduct cost of goods sold, which is what they pay to grow or buy the product, but they can't deduct mileage and rent and salaries of sellers. It's the selling function. They can't deduct advertising. They can't deduct billboards. So it's a very strange rule. And the cannabis industry says, wait a minute, the hitman, and this comes back to what you were talking about earlier. The hitman on a mafia kill can deduct the cost of his gun or depreciate his gun, and we can't deduct our electricity. Well, the grower can, but the retailer can't. And Congress was mad at drugs, so they put this rule in. By the way, there are other rules like that. Their lobbying expenses are not deductible. Bribes paid to foreign officials are not deductible. So this is not the only case where Congress went in and says, we don't like this, we're going to do something about it.
Right. So those who are kind of following at home, some of the stuff that you can't deduct under 280 is your advertising, your rent, your payments to selling personnel, your utilities. So fast forward to the modern era, this becomes very problematic for specifically businesses that are selling cannabis to consumers. There's a lot of stuff that they can't deduct.
Right. Well, let me just clarify that the grower can deduct the salaries of his people. That is, they go into what does it cost? How do you produce a pound of cannabis? Well, you have workers. You may have lights. You may have rent on the property. You may, if you don't own the property, you have a lot of farm equipment, fertilizer. All that stuff is deductible. But when you get to the retail side, the storefront becomes it's a selling expense. You're not paying for cannabis then. You're paying to sell it, and that's what's not deductible. Selling expenses are not deductible.
And then from the policy side, one of the really interesting areas that it affects that I wanted to talk more about, because something you've written a lot about is its effect on advertising. By prohibiting businesses from deducting their advertising expenses, you effectively make advertising more expensive and as a result, more scarce. And walk us through, because there are pros and cons of doing that. So what are the policy issues at play when you have that type of impact on advertising for these businesses?
Well, advertising is if you come at it from the point of view from somebody who wants to legalize, advertising is a little bit of a red flag. Advertising is, parents see the billboard and they say, don't look over there, Johnny. Johnny says, what's that? What's weed? And who are those beautiful people and why are they wanting weed? And the parents, that's not a plus for the legalization movement. Now, advertising is in many cases constitutionally protected under the First Amendment. And states you don't have a constitutional right to advertise a federally illegal drug under the federal Constitution. But most of the states have constitutions that kind of track the federal First Amendment and say, yes, our state has freedom of speech. So that's an independent right to advertise. And that's why you say, even as many of the legislatures would like to tamp down on advertising, they can't because of the constitutional freedom in their state constitution. So we're left with this ability to say, well, it needn't be tax deductible. You can do it, but you just can't deduct it for your taxes. And that has the effect of keeping the noise down, of keeping the glamour and the glitz down. And I think it's a plus for the legalization movement. And let me say, normal, the national normal with my friend Justin Strickle up there is they go along with that. Justin came from patriotic millionaires, and he's a little nervous about big business and wealth. And big business has I think for big business of advertising is word of mouth is for small business. So there are two factors that might say, let's keep the noise down here. The parents and the voters just not wanting to see a lot of glitz and glamour, and the big business versus small business issue.
It's interesting because in the private work that I do now, when you talk to people in local government or you talk to state elected officials, and you really drill down on what their issues are. So if they oppose having cannabis businesses in their community, it really is a lot of advertising. And I think that the first few years of legalization, specifically with some stuff that happened in California, I think have scared, and I think the industry is still paying for it today, where you talk to some legislators and they don't want the Statue of Liberty, on roller skates outside of a dispensary holding up a sign saying, get
Right.
your weed
Right.
here. And that's stuff that I think the industry largely has moved away from. But that's still, that advertising piece is very important to a lot of state and local officials when they think about this industry still. So talk to me a little bit about obviously not everybody agrees with that, right? So the industry, sure. There are people in the industry are pushing back pretty hard on 280.
Right. And the industry says, we're just like any other business, treat us like any other business. But that's not going to happen. We're not going to tax marijuana businesses like dairies, like milk businesses. And so it's kind of choose your poison. And let me say, there's a lot of primitive thinking going on on the tax side, both from the industry side and the government side. And I mean, my opinion is that raising taxes or raising money by keeping ads non-deductible is the most palatable tax I can think of, as opposed to just taxing the product.
So when you say primitive thinking, what is an example of that kind of overly simplistic thinking about cannabis tax policy?
Yeah, I think the fight against 280, there are parts of 280E that are overbroad. To say that you can't deduct your retail store employees' health insurance that's too much. Attorneys' fees, accountants' fees, but there's some. So 280E is overbroad, but it's not been looked at in detail. It's just been looked at en masse. On the government side, there are a lot of short-sighted things going on. Taxing by price of the product when the price is sure to decline. In every state so far, we've seen price collapses as legalization happens, as stores open, as growers roll up. Taxing by price just means that the revenue is going to go down over time for the same amount of product because the price will go down. Another thing is trying to tax producers. Producers the localities do this. They can go somewhere else. They're going to go to the next county over in the long run. Now, localities are getting money from producers now in California especially, but no state taxes tobacco producers. And you have this weird situation of having a state market. Nobody can import into your state. But there are a lot of things. Those are a couple examples.
I have a podcast that I listen to a lot. This guy named Bill Simmons who has started this group called The Ringer, and he's kind of the flagship podcast for it. And he's got this thing where he talks with one of the other guys he has in the show all the time about zigging when everybody else is zagging. And that's applied to like sports takes. But one of the things I've seen you zig where a lot of other people zagged is doubling down on 280E, which is you have a lot of people in the cannabis industry who think 280E is just death. It's the worst.
Yeah.
But then Pat Oglesby on his blog is like, well, actually, 280E could actually be a great tool to expand if you applied to tobacco walls or pharma advertising for optional type of drugs. Can you talk a little bit about 280E as actually a broader tool to limit advertising for some things that?
Yeah, I would say let's do the same thing for tobacco, for alcohol, for direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical ads. These TV ads where they're trying to some drug companies trying to sell you a drug and they have this long list of side effects. Well, the American Medical Association would like to ban those, but they can't because of freedom of speech. So there are bills in Congress now to make the same kind of idea apply to those direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical ads and say they're not deductible. Now, they aren't getting anywhere, but I think the policy is sound, or at least worth thinking about.
And can you talk a little bit about why, because I think a lot of people who aren't familiar with how tobacco advertising is regulated, why tobacco gets especially strong restrictions on its own advertising?
Yeah, because they signed away their rights in the Master Settlement Agreement, which was in the early 2000s, I think. And because they were found guilty of lying to people in their advertising, they said, okay, we're going to accept these restrictions on advertising in the future.
And that's something I think is a misconception when people talk about advertising for cannabis specifically versus tobacco. Yeah. Is there's a lot of people who don't want to see cannabis, but they think that they can pull the same levers for cannabis that they can for tobacco, and it's just not possible in the same way, right? Because of the settlement agreements. Right. And you broke down what you call tobacco power walls. Is that the industry term? Is that what the common lexicon is? Can you describe what a tobacco power wall is?
Well, if you walk into a convenience store, you're bombarded with a wall of cigarettes or a huge display of cigarettes, and that's the tobacco companies can do that. They can have on-site just showing their product. And that doesn't count as advertising, but it's a substitute. It's really luring the shopper's attention to, hey, here's tobacco. Looks good. Try some. And
it has an impact on, I mean, this has been studied. It has an impact on tobacco consumption, is having those power walls. So under the Pat Oglesby model, how would you tax that? Like, how would that fit with 280E?
And here, this is something that I need to think about more. And I'd love to have some industry people think about it with me. I'm, as you say, kind of on my own out here. But what 280E does now is says the entire store, the rent for that entire store is non-tax deductible. And it works well for cannabis now, since cannabis stores basically don't sell anything else. They might sell pipes and papers, but that's about it. And so they don't have to divide up what's devoted to cannabis and what's devoted to other stuff. But so far, I mean, the first cut would be, rent is not deductible. So the whole thing, the whole store, include, the shelves, the windows, the floor space, that's too harsh in all likelihood, but it's a first cut.
When we talk about 280E, really from a government perspective, one of the reasons why that exists and continues to exist is because it's a key revenue source for government. Government is very jealously protects its revenue sources. And so it's kind of like the Indiana Jones brass monkey is, if you're going to take that away, you have to replace it with something else. Right. So what do you replace that with if you take 280E away?
Yeah, and you got to figure that when federal legalization comes, that it won't come with a tax cut, with just eliminating 280E and doing nothing else. Well, the Blumenauer Wyden bill from a couple of years ago, which is once again introduced this Congress, has a tax plan. It starts out with a price-based tax and then phases that out and goes to taxing bud by weight, trim by weight, raw plant material by weight, and then everything else by THC concentration. That is basically the model that Canada is using too. And I think that's probably the state of the art. So you'd separate the supply chain into two parts, tax everything that's sold raw by weight, by its own weight, but then test everything else. It's very hard to test flour. I mean, to figure how much THC is in this flour, people are going to have sampling games. They're going to have friendly testers, and the results are just not that standard. But when anything gets concentrated and then made into liquid form to put into edibles or whatever, it's the readings are more precise, and it's probably useful to go ahead and say, okay, we'll tax the THC content. Neither of those is a perfect tax, but they may be the state of the art today and the best we could think of so far.
So let's pull back, because one of the great things I like reading and on your blog and following on Twitter is when you see states that or municipalities that are just doing it completely wrong. So when you're looking at it from a regulator perspective, what are the different metrics? What are the different levers that you can pull as far as taxation? So what do you have in your toolkit as far as the different ways you can tax cannabis?
Well, the most important thing is what you tax.
Mm-hmm.
And the early days, the taxes were all percentage of price. Colorado came in at 15% wholesale and 15% of retail, or 10% of retail. Washington came in with 3 tiers, and now they're all just taxing at retail. So
Mm-hmm.
the first question is, do we tax percentage of price, or do we tax something else? Do we tax weight, tax grams of flour and tax grams of THC and other stuff? So that's the first lever. Where you collect the tax kind of follows from other factors. Washington collects at retail, and they have, part of the reason is they have like 1,400 growers and 500 retailers. And it's to go and try to collect something from 1,400 growers is a lot harder than just saying we'll wait and collect it at the retail level. But for other stuff, for alcohol and tobacco, so mature industries, and that cannabis is going to evolve, will be unrecognizable. Whether it'll end up like alcohol and tobacco are today, with small number of producers, huge number of retailers. Mm-hmm. So the tax is collected pre-retail for alcohol and tobacco everywhere. It's collected whether at the manufacturer or distributor level.
So you've got from kind of a fundamental level, you've got THC content, you have weight, you have category of product that you're selling. Right. And each of those, right, has pros and cons. So when you talk about weight may be suitable for raw plant material, for buds, but it really doesn't apply to something like a concentrate, where even a small change in the amount of THC can be a significant amount of active ingredient that you're missing in the tax policy, right? And the same is true when you flip it for THC content, where that may be more appropriate for a processed packaged good, right, but it's extremely difficult and inefficient to apply to raw product. So it's so challenging to try to come up with such diversified product offerings. I can't think of a product that when you sell has so many different ways you can consume it.
Yeah.
And so you think the Canadian model and also the kind of the proposed federal model is the way to go, though, in kind of segmenting out the market in those different ways that you tax.
Basically 2 segments: raw material and processed material. And so if it goes into a cookie, it is the THC is tested, and we know how much is in that cookie, or pretty much we have a good idea about it. And so we tax that by THC.
Does that create a perverse incentive at all for people to walk that line and try to get just under whatever? Oh, I guess I'm sorry, because I'm thinking of Illinois'.
Yeah, and when you talk about unforced errors, there's one that they have a bright line that if it's under 35%, it bears a lower tax rate than if it's over 30. That's 35% and over. I mean, that's crazy. People will, whether they'll doctor the raw material with keef or oil to get it right up to 34.9%. That's just an opportunity for games, and it's just silly, and it's primitive. I mean, they were in good faith trying to think up something new, and it's just there are going to be a lot of experiments that don't work.
Right. So let's talk about that Illinois model really quick. The proposed, or the structure of the Illinois model would be 10% of the purchase price would be for cannabis with THC level at or below 35%, 20% of purchase price for all cannabis infused products, and 25% of the purchase price would be cannabis with a THC level of 35%. And I love your commentary on this, which was saying that this is obviously the 35 and above is meant to apply to concentrates, things that have a very concentrated THC, but a flower that would reach that point would be like a bodybuilder who can't like bend over and touch his toes because it's so intensely packed with THC that there's basically not room for any other organic matter in the plant. I love that. And so, I mean, so you think it's just an unforced error that this is a system that's just going to be rife with people who are trying to game the system.
Yeah, at the margin, and whether it's a huge problem or just minor gaming, I don't know. But I don't think that'll stand the test of time. There's no reason, just if you're going to tax THC content, just tax it.
But once you create that type of structure, even if it's a cumbersome, poor structure, right? And so, for example, Illinois, right? If you have this model in place, it's really not as easy as just saying, it's a bad model, let's throw it out. Because to reconfigure the way that an entire industry is taxed, that's something that is extremely difficult to claw back once you've got that in place.
Absolutely.
Let me talk about one of the final things I wanted to touch on with you, something you've written about, and it's something that my co-hosts and I go back and forth with a lot, and that's state-owned stores. So you've got the State of the Union right now, where you had New Mexico have a cup of coffee with the idea. You had Utah start going down that road and decide to pull back on that. You have a limited state-owned store model in Louisiana, right, with 2 licensees. So what do you think the pros and the cons of a state-owned cannabis dispensary is?
Well, the cons are that the cannabis community of all people doesn't trust government. They have learned, and they correctly think that government has been their enemy. And now that when government stores, wait a minute, these are the last people I want selling cannabis to me. Mm-hmm. I don't want to shop there. The pros are, we have let me say that in Canada, several of the provinces have government-owned stores. This is not a crazy idea for them. We have in North Carolina, we have government-owned liquor stores. That's the only place you can buy liquor. I think there are about 17 states like that. And it's a model that keeps the noise down, that keeps advertising down, that puts money in the public coffers. And kind of those are the arguments for it. And the public health folks will say, the government can be less aggressive in marketing and less so youth aren't going to see, they're not going to have billboards out there. They're going to have just the store, come to the store and get it. And government is in bad favor these days. Government has gotten so many things wrong that people don't trust government. It's not just the cannabis community that doesn't trust government. It's a lot of other people, especially young people. We've done some polling, and the notion of having government stores is much more popular with old people than with young people.
Well, and from a regulatory perspective, it's interesting because creating a state-owned dispensary, I think there's a couple arguments against it that I've heard that have been persuasive. One is that it's still federally illegal, and so you put all of those people in jeopardy of basically being charged by the feds, which I don't buy. I've never really bought. I think that the canary, now there's obviously a risk, right? So there is a non-zero probability something could go wrong there, but I don't think that government employees are the canaries in the coal mines if the federal government decides to start cracking down.
Let me just stop you there. That's preposterous.
Right.
If the federal government decides, if there's a major shift at the federal level and they want to go after cannabis, they are not going to arrest workers at state stores. No jury's no prosecutor is going to prosecute those people. No jury.
Right. Worst case scenario is a cease and desist, right?
That's the worst.
From a U.S. attorney.
No jury's going to convict a state employee of violating the federal marijuana law when he was working for the state. That's just not going to happen. It's false advertising.
The second thing I've seen is that, government already has challenges doing what it does, right? And anytime you expand it, specifically when you put something out there into private enterprise, you are because someone from the government is going to have to run those things, hire those people, that you're getting it to act outside its core competency. And the government, its core competency is not running a business, right? So you do get higher revenue source, which is you have repeatedly written, despite the rise in popularity of cannabis, the revenue from taxes on cannabis have always been much more popular than cannabis, have a much broader base. Right. So I've looked a lot at this, and Tony, who's my co-host, is almost militant to the level of like there's just so many things that I think could go wrong when you have government managing a cannabis store, that the risk is almost a policy argument against it, because nobody's going to want to have their head roll or be asked to resign because of a poorly managed marijuana store, right? Right. There are states that have created an alcohol model where you have state-owned distribution or sales for alcohol, right? And it's the cannabis state-owned stores exist today. So do you think that there's a future? Do you think that that's a viable possibility in the next few years for some of the more conservative states to create that type of model?
It might be. And for now, though, I'm really curious about how it's working in Canada. And they have enough provinces that have state-owned cannabis stores up there, and that's the only place you can buy it. I'd like to see how it works out up there.
Are there any kind of early reports on how it's going so far?
I'm sure there are.
Okay. We'll have to have
I'm
you
sure
back to talk about that.
Yeah, and I'm sure there are complaints because there's not enough supply. Everywhere you legalize earlier, in the early days, there's not enough supply. Prices are high, and product is not rolling in. But there may be some states where resistance to legalization is strong enough that people say, okay, well, let's do a state store. That'll mollify some people, and we'll have it under our control. We won't have these profit-seeking corporations in here with trying to be the Walmart of cannabis with a store on every corner. We'll just have our little state store. That might prevail, and it might be that some states go that way.
That's why I was really interested, and in a way kind of disappointed that Utah didn't become that model, because I thought of any of the states that have moved forward with medical marijuana, Utah really fits that mold of you have pretty homogenous population, a very conservative population. It's very spread out besides Salt Lake City. So you don't really have these heavy concentrations. So like the revenue and the margins are just not going to be that great if you're especially if you allow like 30 to exist in Utah. It's going to be tough to make your nut. And so you have a state-owned model where revenue really isn't the primary driver, or at least profits aren't the primary driver, and you can have more of a consistent supply chain throughout the state. And given how conservative that the state was, I thought they were the best test case so far.
Yeah, I did too, and I was disappointed that. I mean, I have an open mind here about how this is going to work, and the people who. Yeah, the government is much more likely to be bureaucratic, not consumer friendly than a private store, where if you've got one choice, and if you don't like it, go somewhere else. And that's why we've seen the FedEx and UPS compete with the post office and probably make the post office better too. But it used to be a real monopoly when I was young.
So what are some of the things that you just kind of wrapping things up? What are some of the things that have surprised you from your studies about tax policy, specifically with cannabis?
I guess I've been surprised by how little the states have really studied this. Now, Gavin Newsom, which I was on his panel there in his Blue Ribbon Commission, he really put some people together, and they looked at things and worked on things and thought about it. And that's why California has a weight-based tax at the producer level. It's $9.25 an ounce for flour. But a lot of the states have just kind of gotten in and listened to the industry. When you look at somewhere like Utah made a lot of this argument that the federal government is going to come in and arrest our workers if we have our state stores, which is just preposterous. But the industry wants to have these stores. I mean, people want to start up stores, and they're willing to. They have an interest in helping legislators get elected and campaign contributions, whatever it takes. So, and there is virtually no lobby for public health, for state stores as a public health measure or even as a revenue measure. Nobody's going to go to the legislature and say, this is my number one issue.
And what kind of excites you now about looking forward? What is really stimulating? What are some of the questions that you want to see answered in the future?
Wow, that's a great question. I think we know kind of all the questions. I'm really interested to see how it plays out. And I think one of the biggest uncertainties to me is how it will play out at the federal level and whether states will be allowed to ban imports. Mm-hmm. There's this federal bill called the States Act that would basically legalize, but states could say we don't allow any imports, which would protect the growers that they have now. So there are going to be states that are going to want that federal model to where they're not going to take it. If you're in Maine and you have a lobby of growers that are up and running, or Massachusetts, and they face no competition from California or Iowa now, they're not interested in that competition. So they're going to favor something more like the States Act, whereas the people in Congress from California and Oregon are going to want it wide open, and so they can export to these cold weather states.
And that's I've thought about that, and that's really interesting because that kind of model flies in the face of just generally how we regulate interstate commerce generally, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Right. So those keeping score at home and who aren't attorneys, there's something called the Dormant Commerce Clause, which means that ultimately Congress regulates interstate commerce and that states can't discriminate against other states, so that you can't discriminate against interstate commerce. So if you own a milk factory in California, right, you effectively can never lobby the state of California to cut off all milk imports so that you can just have a milk monopoly in California.
Right.
To allow this basically a statutory end around the Dormant Commerce Clause would be, I mean, the lawsuits there would be tremendous to follow.
Yeah, and I hear that a lot, but I think it's clearer than that. And I again, nobody's litigated this. I don't know how it might come out, but my clear read is that all this dormant commerce stuff is because Congress has not spoken. And Congress can say, under its power to regulate interstate commerce, it can say states can prohibit imports if they want to. And Congress has not said that. But here we have an industry where there are a lot of people who might be interested in having Congress say that. So it'll be interesting to see if it plays out. I think if Congress, it's my opinion, Christian, you look at this. I mean, this is, I keep saying this and hoping to hear the answer back. But my take is Congress can allow states to ban imports. And whether that's right or wrong, I don't know, but I have an opinion satisfactory to myself.
Well, like you said, we don't use juries anymore, so maybe we'll have some juries make that decision.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
Well, it's been such a pleasure, and I'd love to have you back on to talk about you write. You're very prolific with what you cover and how you write, and I'd love to keep talking to you about cannabis taxation issues, policy, whatever else you want to talk about on an ongoing basis.
Christian, thanks. This has been great fun. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, it was such a pleasure to have you. Hopefully we'll have you back again, and enjoy North Carolina. Tallahassee these days, which is where I'm broadcasting from. It was colder than Anchorage, Alaska 2 days ago. So it looks lovely though. I've got Pat on a video cam. It looks beautiful up in North Carolina. So
yeah, it's pretty good.
Have a wonderful day. Have a wonderful rest of your week. And hopefully I'll get to talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Christian. And keep up the good work.
That's going to do it for the podcast this week. Big thanks to Pat Oglesby for jumping on to record. Tony and I will be back with you next week. We've got a really cool show coming up that we recorded live at FAMU on hemp and some of the opportunities for young people who would like to work in the cannabis industry. We're just finishing up editing that right now. Look for that in the next few days. By the way, before you go, you see that app that you're listening to us on? We would so much appreciate it if before you put your phone down or you close your laptop, you click on that app and you give the show a rating. 5 stars only, people. It helps people find us. This show is growing, and Tony and I love checking the numbers every week. It's personally one of the highlights of my week. It's just so cool. Your ratings and reviews keep this big train moving. It helps people find us. It helps with the aggregators, and just generally all around helps with the health of the show. All right, be good. Have a great week, and remember, stay compliant.